let's talk today about Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Because as I've said a number of times in these videos, the French Revolution is really sort of a major structuring event for the Romantic era and for the Age of Revolutions. Even though there's not a revolution in Great Britain, the French Revolution is still an event that really shapes the mindset of this period and shapes the way that people think about politics, think about themselves in a national context and things like this. And so Burke writes one of the most influential tracts on the consequences and the meaning of the French Revolution. Now, one of the things, so we'll start out here, one of the things that's really interesting about Burke's opposition to the French Revolution is that earlier in his career as a politician, he had been quite liberal, and he had actually been a supporter of the American Revolution, and he gave a famous a speech that's called On the Conciliation of the American Colonies, and basically what he argues for in that speech is that the British should grant the American colonies their liberty, or they should find some sort of mutually beneficial arrangement, because love of liberty is deeply ingrained in Americans coming out of a British tradition. So it's somewhat surprising that Burke is such a visceral opponent of the French Revolution, which many people at the time, and indeed many people today, see as grounded in the same kind of principles as the American Revolution. So let's talk about a couple of the reasons why Burke opposes the French Revolution. So the first thing that he does in the excerpt we have in this book is he tries to explain why the British have a strain of liberty, why the British have a type of liberty, and the French don't. And basically what he appeals to is the great English heritage of democracy, which starts in 1215 with Magna Carta, and goes through the English Civil War, and things like this, and then sort of gets expanded periodically throughout the Victorian age, up through the 1900s, when you get universal suffrage in Britain, where everyone gets a vote. Of course, Burke didn't know that was going to happen, but he ties this idea of political liberty to the idea of inheritance. And this is a bit of a tricky concept for Burke, because on the one hand, you have a very sort of direct economic, property-based understanding of inheritance, where property, land, estates, money, possessions of different kinds are passed down through the generations, and Burke says this is one of the sort of key components of liberty because it allows for a secure future. He also connects this to a political inheritance, and this is where he starts to draw a big distinction between the British and the French, because while the French have inheritance laws that pass down property through first sons, they don't have a heritage of political liberty. They have an absolute monarchy, which means that the king is the state. The king is the law. There's no parliament, there's no sort of democratic representation. Even the nobles have very, very limited political power. The nobles can advise, they can suggest, but the king's word is law. The British don't have this, partially because of the Civil War in the 1640s, which deposed the English monarchy of Charles I. And then the Restoration in 1660 brings back a very limited form of monarchy, where Charles II and subsequent British monarchs have to work in concert with Parliament, which is, of course, the representatives of the British people. So, one thing that Burke is appealing to here is a heritage of liberty that is passed down through the generations in Britain. Where this sort of falls short, or where Burke doesn't sort of take this, is the question of how can the French gain liberty, or how can the French gain freedom without having this inheritance? Because all Burke says, really, about here's how you get liberty is to have an inheritance of it. So, unless the French sort of go back in time, centuries, back to the medieval period and say, hey guys, create the building blocks for a foundation of liberty, so that centuries in the future maybe we can have political freedom, Burke doesn't really give us a sense of how this could be achieved. Instead, what he goes to is a very conservative, nostalgic, and really, interestingly, a very romantic notion of European tradition, European culture. So he starts out here, this page 190, we've got here 190 to the top of 191, we've got really interesting contrasts. So this large section on 190, Burke is describing the Revolutionaries, and he is describing this like horrendous mob violence and toothless crones and basically barbarians sort of storming this beautiful castle, which is not entirely untrue, but it also, one of the things that Burke does here, that he's very careful to do here, is that he dehistoricizes the event. And what I mean by that is that the revolution is just this crazy thing that happens for no apparent reason. So, in Burke's depiction of the revolutionaries here on 190, there's no discussion of the fact that large portions of the French population, especially the urban poor living in Paris, which made up the majority of Paris's population, were starving. People were subject to basically punitive political punishments. You could be locked up with no trial for no sort of stated reason. I mean, this was a really dramatically oppressive society, and Burke takes all of that out of the equation here and just gives us what he calls a band of cruel ruffians and assassins reeking with blood. And so this is actually part of the sort of ideological game that Burke is playing, where he is painting basically the worst possible picture of the revolutionaries, where they're this sort of dirty, violent, malignant evil with no sort of purpose or goal or cause or justification. But then from the bottom of 190 through the top of 191, we get a contrast with this, because we get a sort of direct depiction of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the King and Queen of France, and they are ideal. I mean, they're these sort of glorious nobles of this old world style, ruled by chivalry, guided by what we would call noblesse oblige, the obligation of nobility to be kind to people below them, to be supportive of people below them. And we get from 191 throughout most of the rest of this piece, we get this depiction of France that basically paints it in terms like an Arthurian romance. I mean, like a medieval romance. We've got chivalric cavaliers who are gloriously willing to serve the king and queen. We've got a monarchy that is benevolent and caring and kind. We've got sort of general prosperity, general knowledge. And he actually, I mean, he says here at the top of 193, not top of 193, but in the first full paragraph on 193, Europe undoubtedly taken in a mass was in a flourishing condition the day on which your revolution was completed. The question that is not answered here, or the question that's not addressed here by Burke is, for whom was Europe flourishing? I mean, it certainly was not doing the starving peasants of France much good. I mean, Louis XVI had everything he wanted. I mean, he had massive amounts of food. He had the finest luxuries. Marie Antoinette had all of the dresses that she wanted, and certainly they weren't terrible people. I mean, they were in a specific historical position, but they were also incredibly. I mean, the French political system was also incredibly oppressive. And Burke mentions this notion. 192 to 193, when the old feudal and chivalrous spirit of fealty, which by freeing kings from fear freed both kings and subjects from the precautions of tyranny, shall be extinct in the minds of men, plots and assassinations will be anticipated by preventative murder and preventative confiscation, and so on and so on. So, what he imagines here is that in the Middle Ages, in this sort of imagined chivalric realm, a very romanticized realm, there was no discontent. Monarchs ruled and they were fine because they trusted the peasants to know their place. Peasants worked their fields and things like that, and they were fine because the king wasn't all that oppressive. What Burke doesn't address here, and I realize that I'm being very critical of Burke, but I think he's wrong about a lot of things, and I say that from basically a Marxist perspective, where Burke's writing is in favor of an exploitative class system, as opposed to what he is ostensibly doing, which would be presenting an objective history, or an objective political analysis. What Burke fails to address or fails to consider is that an absolute monarch can be a tyrant, even if the rest of the country is filled with peasants. And this is the thing, is that the French monarchy, because it was absolutist, and because the king's word was law, and because peasants had no rights of any kind, it became unsustainable to have that kind of political system when you're in Enlightenment Europe, where you have sort of philosophies of liberty, human rights, and things like this. So, I think Burke is right in his critique that the French Revolution is not taking the right approach to achieve its ideological goals, but I think he's wrong in the belief that everything in France was good before the revolution, and the revolution is totally unjustified.